The gates of Stonehaven locked before dawn. Every road sealed. Every rider deployed north. A king who had never once spoken her name in 3 years was now dismantling his entire kingdom to find her. On her desk, they found it. A peace treaty, left half-finished, 33 pages untranslated, and 7 quiet words written beneath the last line she would ever complete in that room. "I hope he sleeps well without me." She had been sitting 6 steps from his chair for 3 years. She had translated every word he'd ever signed, every alliance he'd built, every secret he'd kept from his council. She knew the shape of his silences better than anyone alive. And he had never looked up. So why, the moment she disappeared, did he seal the entire city and ride 3 days through winter forest without stopping? Watch till the end, because the answer will break your heart before it puts it back together. The gates of Stonehaven closed before dawn. Knock quietly, never quietly, when the king commanded it. The sound rang out across the sleeping city like a held breath snapping. Iron on iron, chain on chain, the low boom of a bar dropping across wood, thick as a man's torso. In their beds, tradespeople turned over and pulled blankets higher. Stable hands straightened, hands going still on the horses they were already preparing. The watchfire on the eastern tower burned brighter, fed by a soldier who did not understand what he was doing, but understood that he should do it fast. In the war room at the top of the hill, Cedric Valdenmore stood with his back to the window and his hands at his side. He was not a man who moved without purpose. 3 years on a contested throne had burned away whatever impulse remained toward restlessness, toward pacing, toward the small betrayals of posture that told onlookers a king was anything less than stone. But his hands were doing something wrong. They curled into fists, then opened flat, then curled again, as though searching for something to grip and finding nothing. Aldrich watched from 3 paces back. He had been in the king's shadow for 7 years, long enough to read the architecture of a room by the way Kide held himself inside it. He had seen the king stand over maps at 3 in the morning, face blank as winter granite, and he had seen him absorb news of ambush and betrayal without the twitch of an eye. He had seen fear in the king's body only once, on the morning after Dunvale, when Kite had stood in the ruins and looked at what his orders had permitted. He was seeing it now. "The translator's rooms are empty," Aldrich said. The words sat between them like stones dropped in a well, the sound of the fall longer than expected. Kaid did not turn. "How long?" "Bed was made before she left. Shelves are cleared. Nothing broken, nothing rushed." A pause. She had time. She chose not to hurry. The window behind the king showed a city beginning to gray at the edges, dawn trying to shoulder through the cloud that had settled over Stonehaven for the last 3 days. The stone of the crenellations was so pale it was almost white. The hill below, the city below that, and somewhere beyond the northern gate, already closed, too late, a road running up through pine forest toward the greywood. "She left something," Aldrich said, and crossed the room. The translation was on the desk. 47 pages of even, slightly rightward-leaning script, the penmanship of someone who had learned to write in difficult conditions and made it disciplined, almost beautiful. The work of a peace treaty that had taken 3 nations 2 years to agree to. The kind of agreement that would take another 6 months to replace if it went unsigned. 47 pages done, 33 left unfinished. At the bottom of the last completed page, below the final line of formal diplomatic language, she had written 7 words in the same unhurried hand. "I hope he sleeps well without me." Aldrich watched the king read them. He watched him read them again. Then, "find her." 2 words. They did not come out like orders. They came out like something tearing slowly, slow enough that the person it was happening to didn't realize it was tearing until it had. Aldrich closed the treaty and set it carefully to one side. Her name is Seren Ashvale. The king turned. In 3 years, Aldrich had never seen him turn that fast. I know that. They looked at each other. Both knew it was not true. Seal the gates, Cade said. His voice had steadied back into command. Not the command of a man in control, but of a man who understood that control was the only option left. Every rider, every route north. Find her. 3 years earlier, Seren Ashvale had arrived in Stonehaven with 4 languages and a bag containing not much else. The daughter of a merchant family gone under, debts, a bad winter, a supplier who had disappeared with money that was not his. She had understood by 16 that her only portable assets were the ones in her head. Latin from the monastery school in her coastal town. Aetoric from the trading ships that stopped at their harbor. Dunmores from a neighbor who had married into a southern family. The old formal tongue of Valdenmore, the one the court still used for ceremony, from a compendium she had read through twice out of boredom during a bedridden winter. She had presented herself at the palace's secondary entrance, the one tradespeople used, with a letter of introduction from a minor treasury official and a translation test she had already completed in the courtyard, while waiting for the clerk to come down. The court archivist had examined the test, looked at her over his spectacles, and said, "Start Monday." 3 years. The same desk at the eastern window, where the morning light came in at the best angle for reading. The same lamp with the green glass shade she had bought herself, because the standard issue lanterns gave her headaches. The same stool, the same inkwell, the same stack of blank pages to the left, and completed pages to the right. She had learned the rhythm of the palace the way she had learned its languages, by listening rather than asking, which corridors held sound differently, and which swallowed it, where warmth pooled in winter. She learned Lord Haveth's footstep by the way it fell heavier on the right side, and Aldrich's by the quality of silence he maintained around it. She learned when the king was coming before she could hear him, from the way the conversation in nearby rooms changed register, not hushed, exactly, but rearranged. She learned these things not because she meant to. She learned them because she was very good at paying attention, and she could not choose not to pay attention to Cedric Valdenmore. He had given her reason to stop once, and only because she had been alone when it happened. It was her 4th week. A trade negotiation had been running for 2 days, and she had been brought in to translate the ethoric sections, commercial clauses that the court's regular interpreter had stumbled over. She had been sitting at the side table, working through a particularly thorny section about tariff percentages, when the aethoric delegation's representative had laid out a clause requiring labor drafts from villages along the border. The clause was small. It was buried on the 3rd page of an appendix. It used language that, in formal trade aethoric, could be read as voluntary labor agreements, but in the older coastal dialect, the one the border villages actually spoke, meant forced requisition. She had finished her translation of it and set the page on the main table. The king had read it. His face did not change. He set it to one side. 10 minutes later, with no announcement, he had declined the entire deal. No one in the room had connected those 2 events. She had, because she had watched him read. He read a footnote. What kind of man reads a footnote in a trade agreement? The kind who knows that footnotes are where the knives are hidden. She had gone back to her desk and translated the next thing she was given. That was where it had started, and she understood from the beginning that it would not go anywhere. She had not told herself stories about it. She was not that kind of fool. She had simply carried it with her, the way you carry something that is heavy but not wrong, not wanting to put it down because putting it down would mean acknowledging how long you had been carrying it. 3 years. 33 unfinished pages. 7 words at the bottom of a page she would not be there to complete. 4 months before she left, the palace held a feast for the autumn harvest. The great hall ran blazing with torches and loud with 100 conversations. Seren had stayed long enough to count herself present and then retreated to the archivist's corridor, which connected the records room to the eastern stairs and was used mostly during working hours. At this time of night, it was empty, lit only by 2 wall sconces spaced so far apart that the middle of the corridor lived in shadow. She was carrying the Meridian letters, 3 dozen folded documents that needed to be cross-referenced against earlier correspondence before tomorrow's diplomatic briefing, which she had volunteered for because it was work, and work was something she understood how to do. The stack came nearly to her chin. She was counting the edges of the pages against her chin, a habit from the days when she used to stack coins as a child, and she was also reciting, very quietly to herself, the opening clause of the 5th Meridian letter, which had a grammatical structure she had not encountered before and wanted to work through aloud. She did not see him coming. There was no reason to see him coming. No one used the archivist's corridor at this hour. The impact was not violent. She had time to pull back. He had time to pull back. The letters scattered rather than flew. But his hand shot out and closed around her wrist before she could step into the wall, and in the half moment before she understood anything else, she understood that she was not falling. The letters settled on the floor like pale birds. Silence. Not relative silence. Not the muffled behind stone silence of a palace corridor at midnight. Something absolute. Something that had nothing to do with the absence of sound, and everything to do with the presence of something else. He stood very still, his hand around her wrist, and the look on his face was not recognition. He was looking past her right shoulder, at the middle distance, at nothing. The look of a man who has been handed something he was not expecting, and does not yet know what it is. She became aware of her heartbeat. Then she became aware that she had been holding her breath. She exhaled, small and careful. He looked down. His eyes in the low light were the color of slate before rain. Not dark, but deeply gray. The kind of gray that holds light rather than reflecting. She had seen them from across a council room 20 times. She had not been 3 feet away when she looked. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice came out level, which surprised her. "I couldn't see past Elle." "It's fine." He said it before she finished. Automatic, not impolite, but already rearranging itself into dismissal. He looked down at her wrist, which he was still holding. His thumb was against her pulse. Not deliberately, just incidentally. The way a hand falls when it reaches for something without time to aim. He let go. "Your Majesty," she said, because it seemed important to establish that she knew who she was speaking to, that this was not, that she was not. He was already 3 steps past her. He paused, not turning. "Go back to the feast. A beat. Or don't." She stood in the corridor in the dark and listened to his footsteps. They slowed, 15 feet away. A strange thing. They slowed, then steadied, then resumed their previous rhythm, as though something had shifted and then been corrected. She knelt to gather the Meridian letters. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she noted without judgment and chose not to examine. She did not go back to the feast. She went to the records room and spent 2 hours cross-referencing correspondence, and if her usual systematic pace was somewhat irregular, there was no one to observe it. 3 months before she left, she went to the Royal Library at an hour she would not have chosen if she had known anyone else was there. She had been working late in the translation rooms, and the particular manuscript she needed, a Byzantine legal text, with a knotted passage about inheritance law relevant to a land dispute she had been asked to clarify, was shelved in the library's northeast corner. She had not thought about who else might be in the library at 2 a.m. She simply needed the book. The library was long and high-ceilinged, and smelled of old leather and the particular kind of cold that accumulates in stone rooms that are never fully warm. She set her candle on the reading table at the near end and walked to the northeast corner without looking toward the shadows at the far end of the room. It was not until she sat down on the floor, the lower shelves were too full to put her candle, so she sat against the far case with the manuscript in her lap, that she realized she was going to read aloud. She did this sometimes, alone, with passages that resisted parsing. The eye skipped things the voice caught. She began reading. The Byzantine formal register was beautiful, even when technically difficult. Long, musical sentences that doubled back on themselves in unexpected places, like streams running under ice. She did not know when she first became aware of the stillness at the other end of the room. She had come to the end of the section she needed. She sat for a moment, the manuscript open in her lap, and then, because the passage was genuinely lovely and she was alone and no one was listening, she read it again, just the last 6 lines, just for herself. Then she closed the book, blew out her candle, and walked back through the dark toward the door. She did not see anyone. The room held only quiet. She learned only later, in a way she did not expect, in a place very far from Stonehaven, that he had been standing in the shadow near the history cases the entire time. She learned, later, that he had gone back to his rooms and slept until morning for the first time in 3 years. She did not know this when she was still in Stonehaven. She knew only that, after that night, there was sometimes a feeling of being watched in the library. Not menacing, just present. She had stopped going at 2 a.m, because she was not a fool, and she understood what it meant to carry something that should be put down. It did not help. 3 weeks before she left, the request had come through Aldrich, as they always did, a note, 2 lines, requesting that she retrieve the Meridian Concordance manuscripts and the accompanying trade ledgers from the auxiliary archive. The auxiliary archive was the older of the palace's 2 records rooms, lower ceilings, poorer light, shelves that had been added over 3 centuries in ways that made architectural sense to no one. The ledgers she needed were on the topmost shelf, which was tall enough to require a rolling ladder. She pulled the ladder into position, checked the floor lock. It was stiff, but it caught, and climbed. The concordance was further back than she had expected, behind a series of rolled documents that had been incorrectly shelved. She stretched for it, fingers finding the edge, and the ladder shifted under her, not far, not dramatically, but the floor lock had been stiff because the mechanism was worn, and worn mechanisms did not always hold. She grabbed the shelf edge with her left hand. The rolling ladder found its new position. The shelf held. Her left hand did not. The bracket holding the upper shelf in place had an edge, not sharp enough to be immediately dangerous, but efficient enough, given the pressure of a sudden grip, a cut that ran from the heel of her palm to just past her wrist. She looked at it, pressed the hem of her sleeve against it, and performed a rapid internal assessment. Not deep. Blood ran freely, but that was the location more than the severity. She climbed down carefully, holding the retrieved manuscript against her chest with her other hand, and began organizing what she needed on the central table. She would need to bind this before continuing. The small cabinet on the south wall held an emergency kit. "Give me your hand." She turned. The king was in the doorway. He had pushed it open far enough to see the room, which meant he had been passing in the corridor, and had seen the door ajar, and had looked in. He was in working clothes rather than formal dress, dark linen, no chain of office, his hair slightly disarranged, which meant he had come from somewhere he had not expected to be seen. Her first impulse was to say, "It's nothing." She was already opening her mouth around the first syllable. "Give me your hand," he said again, not louder, just certain. She gave him her hand. He moved the small stool near the table and sat, and gestured for her to sit on the low chest beside it, and opened the emergency cabinet himself. His hands found the supplies without fumbling, which told her he had done this before, in conditions probably worse than this. He cleaned the cut without asking permission or explaining his actions. She looked at the top of his head, the dark hair slightly longer at the back of the neck than was fashionable for the court. The line of his jaw from above was sharper than from across a room. "The scar," she said, before she had decided to. "The one by your eyebrow." He didn't look up. "What about it?" I've... She stopped. Starting that sentence with "I've noticed" would require a clarification of how often she had been looking. "I was just curious." A pause. His thumb pressed gently against either side of the cut, checking depth. "Paper knife. When I was 16, looking at a map instead of my desk." She had imagined, involuntarily, over 3 years, the various histories of that scar. A sword, a training accident, some moment of consequence she would never be told. A paper knife at 16. A boy not watching where he put his hands. "Careless," she said. Her voice came out lighter than she had expected. He began winding gauze. His attention was entirely on her hand. "Hold still." She held still. She could see the edge of his profile, the slight concentration between his brow. He was careful, not gentle in a performed way, careful in the way of someone who does not want to cause unnecessary pain and is willing to slow down to prevent it. When he reached the final wrap, he had to hold her wrist with one hand, to anchor the gauze against her palm with the other, and they sat for a moment in a configuration that had no reasonable explanation, except that it was practical, and that both of them were very aware of it, and that neither of them said so. His thumb moved, just once, a small, brief pressure against the inside of her wrist, where the pulse was. It could have been intentional. It could have been the automatic gesture of someone trained to check for irregularities after a wound. He let go. "Don't climb without locking the wheel properly," he said, standing. "I did lock it," she said. "It slipped." He looked at the ladder. "I'll have it replaced." He looked down at her bandaged hand. Something moved across his face. Not quite readable, not quite gone before she could look. "Leave the ledgers. I'll have someone else one." "I can finish," she said. "I'll use the short stool for the lower shelves." He looked at her for a moment, fully, directly, the way he looked at things he was assessing rather than dismissing. "Fine," he said, and left. She sat on the low chest for longer than was practical. Her heartbeat, she noted, was somewhat irregular. She noted this and moved on. The next morning on her desk, there was a stool she had not put there. Sturdier than the standard issue, better made, 12 inches taller, with a small iron grip on the top rung. No note. No name. The style matched nothing else in the archive room. Maren, who came in to set out fresh candles, looked at it and said, "Where did that come from?" Seren said she wasn't sure, and went back to work. She did not think about the stool again. She thought about it constantly. Lady Cerise Dunmore had been in the palace for 2 weeks before the formal announcement. This was understood by everyone in the palace, and spoken of by no one directly, which was the court's way of managing information that was both certain and uncomfortable. She was a guest of the crown, elegant in the way of the southern houses, a quality of self-possession that sat lightly rather than asserting itself, musical accomplishments, genuine ease with political conversation. She had been placed at the king's table on 4 separate occasions before the announcement, and she had handled each of them with a grace that made even Lord Half's approval visible. Seren had observed all of this from across whatever room she happened to be in, with the flat, accurate perception she applied to everything that needed translating, which was not the same as understood, but was often close enough. She had known it was coming. The political reasons were sufficient and well publicized. The southern trade routes, the succession question, alliances that needed strengthening. She had translated the preliminary correspondence. She knew the terms before Lord Haveth presented them. Knowing had not helped. The announcement came on a Tuesday in the council chamber, with Seren at her side table in her usual position. Arranged the formal introduction. The king said it to Lord Haveth without inflection, his fingers pressed briefly to his right temple. His tell, the one she had catalogued over 3 years. The pressure that appeared when he was managing something he had already decided. He turned back to the other matter on the table. The meeting continued. The quill in her hand moved steadily across the page. The transcription was accurate. She checked the ink level in the well and found it full. At the bottom of the page, in the final section, the hand had gone slightly smaller. Just slightly. No one who had not been looking for 3 years would have seen it. The winter betrothal feast came a week later. The great hall dressed itself in evergreen and candle smoke, and the tables were set with the palace's good linen, the kind that only came out for occasions with political weight. Seren sat at the lower staff table with Maren and 3 junior archivists who were already halfway through their wine. "Drink something," Maren said, not unkindly. "I'm fine." "You're counting the bricks in the far wall." She was, in fact, counting the bricks in the far wall. She stopped. At the high table, Lady Cerise sat at the king's right hand. She was luminous in wine red, dark hair dressed high, and pinned with something amber that caught the torchlight when she turned. She turned often, animating every conversation, tilting her face toward the king with the ease of someone who genuinely enjoyed talking, rather than performing it. The king sat beside her and was courteous. Seren knew his courtesy from professional observation. She had watched it applied to foreign dignitaries, to fractious council members, to the visiting representatives of 3 different religious houses. It was impeccable. It did not cost him anything because it did not require anything. She watched him return it to Lady Cerise and felt it in her chest, like a specific weight being added to something that was already very heavy. Then he looked up. Not at Cerise. Not at the room in the practiced sweep that surveyed and dismissed in the same motion. He looked across the hall, toward the staff table, and his gaze stopped. It stopped on her. 1 second, maybe less. His eyes, grey, the color of old river stone, lit amber from the far side by torchlight, met hers across the space of the entire room. Then they moved on. He had been doing the sweep. He had seen her in the way you see a chair or a doorway, taken in the information woman, still, no threat, and moved to the next point. He had not seen her, had not recognized the person the eyes landed on. She had been looked at and not seen. She set down the glass Maren had pressed into her hands at some earlier point. She stood, made the appropriate excuse with a tilt of her head toward the corridor, and walked out of the hall. Maren watched her go, said nothing. In her room, Seren sat on the edge of the bed and let herself be still. The window showed Stonehaven's lower city, the lights going amber one by one, as people closed their shutters and laid their fires lower for the night. A city she had come to know the way you know a thing you have no particular reason to love, but have grown fond of anyway, gradually, without deciding to, until it was simply part of the texture of existing. After a while, she got up and began going through the desk. It was not a decision, so much as the completion of a decision already made. She had known since the council room a week ago. She had given herself time to be wrong, to find some other interpretation, and she had found none, because she was too careful a reader to fabricate what was not there. She left the books that belonged to the palace. She left the green glass lamp. She packed with the efficiency of someone who had packed before, under worse circumstances. The personal quill bought herself 2 changes of linen. The compact Latin grammar she had been given by a teacher who probably didn't remember her. A letter of introduction she had written and rewritten 3 times until it said exactly what needed to be said and nothing that didn't. She sat at the desk one last time. The peace treaty was already out. She had brought it back to work on the final section before tomorrow's deadline. 47 pages, precise and complete. 33, left unfinished. She looked at it for a moment, thought about the provisions it secured. Border families, trade routes, a generation of not war that would be invisible because it would simply be the ordinary texture of life. She had spent 3 weeks on this. She knew every clause of it now, the way you know a piece of music you have played many times, not just the notes, but the places where the performer chooses to breathe. She picked up the working draft, the annotated copy, covered in her notes and second guesses, the pages she had been using to build the final version. She held it for a moment, and then, because she could not fully explain why, put it in the bag. Not the clean copy. This one. The version that had her thinking in the margins. She would understand later why she had kept it. She sat at the desk one last time and picked up the quill. At the bottom of page 47, below the last line of formal diplomatic language she would ever translate in this room, she wrote 7 words in her careful hand. I hope he sleeps well without me. Small and honest, and not entirely fair, and she did not cross them out. She set the quill down, placed the clean copy of the treaty in the center of the desk, 47 pages, exactly as she had found it, and went to find Maren. Maren was in the servants' corridor, returning from an errand, and stopped when she saw Seren's face. You're going. There's a position at the monastery of St. Edrans, in the Greywood. Seren kept her voice even, which was not difficult. She had 3 years of practice keeping her voice even. They need a translator for their manuscript archive. I wrote to them 3 months ago. They've replied. 3 months ago. Maren looked at her. You've been planning this. I've been leaving a door open. The door open. Maren was quiet for a moment that stretched to several. She was a practical woman, the daughter of a blacksmith, with red hair she managed with pins and a way of seeing through sentiment that Seren had spent 3 years being grateful for. She did not soften things as a rule. He won't come for you, she said. You know that. I know. I'm not saying it to be cruel, though. I know, Maren. Not sharp. Just certain, in the way of someone who has already done the grief work and arrived on the other side of it, exhausted and steady. I know he won't come. That's not why I'm going. A beat. I'm going because staying is no longer something I can do, not because I'm hoping for something, because I have nothing left to hope for, and I would like to stop. Maren looked at her for a long moment. Then, when do you leave? Tonight. The supply gate opens at 4 for the morning deliveries. I'll walk you to it. The Stonehaven night was cold enough that their breath made brief shapes in the air before disappearing. Maren walked beside her without speaking, which was its own kind of company. At the supply gate, wooden and wide, flanked by sleepy torches, Maren stopped. "Right when you get there." "I will. And don't do anything I'd find tedious to attend." Seren almost smiled. "I'll do my best." They did not embrace. They had never been people who embraced. Maren put her hand briefly on Seren's arm, the wrapped one, the one that had been bandaged 3 weeks ago by careful hands in the archive room, and then took it away. Seren walked out through the gate. The road north ran pale and flat through the dark, following the river for the first mile, and then climbing into pine and granite. She had translated the monastery's founding charter 2 years ago, and remembered every turn. She walked north. The gate closed behind her. The winter was very large and very quiet, and did not require anything from her. She did not cry. She had expected she might. The cold air was clean in her throat, and the road was clear, and she counted the paces to the first bend in the river with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the body will carry the mind tonight, and not the other way around. Caid woke at 4 in the morning. This was not unusual. He had not slept through a night in 3 years without the specific exception of the nights following his late visits to the library. But this was different in a way he did not immediately understand. He lay with his eyes open in the dark of his chamber and tried to locate the problem. Then he understood. There was a point in the palace that was always slightly quieter than the rest. He had been aware of it without being aware of being aware of it. The way you're aware of a window that doesn't draft, or a chair that doesn't creak, without ever considering these things as things to notice. He had known, without knowing it, that there was a direction from which the noise that lived in his skull was slightly less. It was gone. The silence that replaced it was enormous and wrong. The silence of a bell jar after the source of sound is removed, rather than the silence of peace. He was on his feet before he was fully dressed. He found Aldrich in the hall outside the war room, already there, already waiting, which should have alarmed him more than it did. "The translator's rooms," he said. "Empty," Aldrich said. Caid kept moving. He walked through the archive corridor, through the library, through the translation room with its desk and its empty shelves, and the faint smell of candle smoke, and something else, some layering of presents that had been systematically removed. Everything that had been hers was gone. Everything that was not hers was arranged with a consideration for its successor that turned something hard and sharp in his chest. And the treaty on the desk, and the 7 words. He read them in the way he read footnotes, completely, attending to all possible meanings simultaneously. Then he stood very still for a moment, with the treaty in his hands. "Seal the gates," he said. "Adelaide." Aldrich presented him with the full account over the following hour. 3 years of records, the translation log, the council session minutes, what she had worked on, what she had contributed, the Meridian Treaty that had secured the eastern border, her translation of a clause the previous interpreter had missed, the Dunmore Commercial Agreement renegotiated favorably based on her identification of an obscure precedent in an archival text no one else had read. Then he presented him with something else. "I've been keeping a separate record," Aldrich said, "for 2 years. Caid looked at him. "The days your headaches were worst, the days they were manageable." He opened the ledger, his own, not a palace document. I cross-referenced it with the palace work schedule. The days she was absent, illness, 2 holidays, 1 week when the archive was closed for repairs. Your symptoms increased significantly. The days she was present, and particularly when she was working late in the library or the translation room, they decreased. Silence. I told myself it was coincidence, Aldrich said. For 6 months I told myself that. Then I stopped telling myself that. Kai did not look at the ledger for long. Why didn't you? Ow. Because you needed to come to it yourself. Flat totein. Not apologetic. I know you well enough to know that. He set the ledger down and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, and behind his eyes the noise roared at a volume that made the world tilt slightly. "Bring Oswin," he said. Brother Oswin was old enough that his face had become mostly bone and decision. He had been a battlefield physician before he was a palace one, and battlefield physicians developed an efficiency of diagnosis that tended to dispense with ceremony. He sat across from the king in the small receiving room, and he did not speak for a long moment. And then he asked, "When you think about her," he touched his own temple, "does it stop?" The fire in the grate was the loudest thing in the room. 10 seconds. I know name, I don't order, Seren, and ain't of you turn how. 12. The answer was not the kind that needed to be retrieved. It was the kind that needed to be admitted. "Yes," Sade said. Oswin nodded. "The curse of Dunvale is conditional. You know this. You've read Agna's account. It endures until you choose to see the one who quiets it. Not touch, not bind. Choose to see." He paused. "You understand the difference?" Kaid understood the difference. Looking at someone was not the same as looking for them, which was not the same as seeing them. He had been in the same room as Seren Ashvale for 3 years. He had looked at her exactly as he looked at furniture and doorways. The tactical sweep that confirmed a room was as expected. He had never once. He stopped that thought where it was. "She's in pain," Oswin said. It was not a question. "The distance is increasing. Whatever holds the two of you in the same resonance, the separation is taxing it. Both directions." Cade stood, slowly, with the measured weight of someone who has decided what comes next and needs to move before the decision becomes more difficult. "Get my horse ready," he said to Aldrich. Lady Cerise Dunmore came to him before he reached the stables. She was dressed for travel already, which was grace of a particular and difficult kind. She had been informed, clearly, before he reached her. She had used the time to prepare rather than to rehearse. "You don't need to explain," she said. He opened his mouth. "I watched you these past 2 weeks. At the council meetings, you have a tell, a small one. You look toward the translation table, not at it, toward it, the way you look at something that helps you think." She paused. "You did it 14 times in the meeting about the northern roads. I counted." The smallest fraction of dry amusement at the corner of her mouth. "I'm very good at numbers." Kaid looked at her and felt the specific discomfort of being accurately seen. "She doesn't know you see her," Cerise said. "That's the problem, I think." A pause that held no cruelty. "No, that's not the problem. The problem is that you don't see her, not yet, and she's run out of patience for the waiting." Another pause. "I don't blame her." "Cerise. I came here hoping." She said it easily, with the precision of someone who has already moved through the difficult part and is standing on the other side of it. "I am not ashamed of that. I came hoping because it was a reasonable hope. Politically reasonable, personally reasonable. You are not unkind. A beat. But the person you light up for, in a room, is not me. And I would rather be alone than be with someone who cannot offer that." She tilted her head slightly. "Go find her. Don't waste any more of either of our time." She turned to go. At the door she stopped without turning back. "I hope she knows what it is to be searched for," she said, to the doorframe rather than to him. Everyone deserves to know that once. The door closed. Lord Haveth materialized in the hallway, because Lord Haveth always materialized at maximum inconvenience. He had a list of political objections that were not unreasonable. I'd let him finish them all. She translated everything, Kide said. Every agreement for 3 years, every clause, every amendment and preliminary correspondence. He looked at Haveth. She knows our diplomatic position in more detail than anyone on this council. Haveth stopped, recalculated visibly. And we let her leave, Cade said, and went to get his horse. 3 riders left Stonehaven before the watch changed. Cade, Aldrich, and Sera, the king's best scout, compact and unhurried, who asked no questions and kept pace without being asked. The northern gate opened for them without ceremony. The road into the Greywood ran straight and pale through the pine forest, and the 3 horses moved at the canter that could be maintained for hours rather than the gallop that burned everything in a mile. Saint-Edran's, Aldrich said, as they cleared the city. It's the only place in the north she'd know. She translated the founding charter 2 years ago. She used her own knowledge to hide from me, Cade thought, and I didn't know her name. The shame of it burned steadily, like a coal rather than a flame, all the way through the dark. St. Adrian stood in the Greywood like a promise that someone had made centuries ago and kept. Stone walls darker with age than the surrounding rock, rounded by weather into something almost organic. A small bell tower that rang the hours for no one in particular, except the brothers who marked their days by it. The nave roof had been replaced twice. The south wall showed the seam where 3 different centuries of mason work met, imperfectly. Seren had arrived on the evening of the 2nd day. The abbot had looked at her letter, looked at her and said, "There's a study available, meals at 6 and noon." She had opened the first manuscript at a table beside a narrow window that overlooked the kitchen garden, and tried to be someone who had put something down and was ready to carry something else. The pull began that afternoon. She had known it was coming. She had known since she read the text on the curse, a document Aldrich had routed to her desk for translation 18 months ago, because bureaucracy did not explain itself, and no one had told her what she was reading until she was on page 12 and understood completely. She had translated it accurately, returned it the next morning without annotation, and said nothing to anyone. The pull was a pressure behind the sternum, directional, south, toward Stonehaven, insistent in the way that physical pain is insistent. It did not ask permission, and it did not pause for argument. She sat with the pressure and read through it. This is the bond separating. This is what the text described. This is mechanics, not feeling. You chose to leave. This is the cost of the choice. She translated 17 pages on the 2nd day. On the 3rd day, her hands shook. She lay in the cell the monastery called a guest chamber, a stone room about the size of a large closet, with a pallet and a single high window, and thought about the text. The curse would worsen with distance. She had known that. She had calculated it, had estimated the rate of increase, had made the decision with full knowledge of what it cost. Because the alternative, staying in the palace, carrying 3 years of silence into a 4th watching, that too had a cost. That cost she had also calculated. She had made the better choice. She was nearly certain. Nearly certain had not prepared her for the sensation, at the end of the 3rd night, of her body trying to compass its way back to something it couldn't help believing was naught. She pressed her fingers against her sternum. She breathed through it. Don't come, she thought, to no one, to someone, to a person who hadn't known her name until 2 days ago at most. You don't know who I am. Don't come for something you never looked at. The pressure continued, distant and approaching, pulling at her like tide. He found her in the way you find things you have been too long without, faster than the search made sense, as though the distance between was collapsing from both ends. The monastery was dark before dawn. The abbot met them at the gate with a lamp and a face that revealed nothing, except that he had been expecting this kind of arrival. Men traveling fast, horses unsettled, urgency in the posture of someone who would not be asked to wait. "She's been ill," he said. "Not dangerously, but she hasn't asked for anything." A pause. "She hasn't asked for anything even when she should have." He led Side through the nave corridor to the guest cell and stepped back without further speech. The door was not locked. It was the kind of door that had never been locked, because the inhabitants of this place understood that the effective barriers were made of intention rather than iron. Kaid pushed it open. Small room. One candle, guttered to a stub. Grey stone walls that held the cold, the way stone always did. Seren was on the narrow pallet with her eyes closed, and her hands folded on her chest, with the precision of someone who has taken deliberate stock of their own body and positioned it as correctly as possible. Her face in the dying candlelight was white. The white of exhaustion rather than illness, the kind of pale that comes from 3 days of exertion that doesn't look like exertion from the outside. He crossed the room and put his hand over hers. She breathed in. The noise in his skull, which had been running for 3 days at a register that felt less like sound and more like structural damage, dropped from roar to hum in the space of a single exhale. Not silence, but bearable. He stood with his hand over hers and let himself breathe for the first time since the gates. Her eyes opened. Gray-green. In this light, he had not known her eyes were gray-green until he was close enough to see them as eyes rather than a direction in a room. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice was rough. "Kaidi." He said it before he'd decided to. "My name is Keed." A pause in which she reassembled herself. He watched her do it, watched the careful process of moving from prone to upright, saw her jaw set against whatever the movement cost her, and made himself not assist because she had not asked, and she was clearly the sort of person for whom assistance that wasn't asked was a different category of insult. "You shouldn't have come," she said. "You shouldn't have left. That was mine to decide." "Yes," he sat on the edge of the pallet, "and this is mine." She looked at him. He looked back, and there was nothing in the room but the candle stub and the stone walls and the two of them, and he could see her deciding whether to believe that this was what it appeared to be, could watch her apply the same careful, accurate attention she gave to everything, looking for the places where a text claimed one thing and meant another. "The betrothal is dissolved," he said. "Lady Cerise dissolved it herself. I did not ask her to." Silence. "I rode 3 days. A pause. I do not ride 3 days for things I don't mean." Seren looked at her hands. The bandage on her left hand, his work, 3 weeks ago, was fraying at the edge. She smoothed it once, absently. "You don't know my name," she said. "Seren Ashvale." He said it without hesitation. "Aldrich told me. I should have known it 3 years ago." Her mouth tightened. Not with anger, with the expression of someone who has been accurate in their expectations and takes no satisfaction in it. "That's not what I mean," she said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached under the pallet and retrieved the working draft of the translation. 47 pages, covered in her marginal notes, the version she could not bring herself to leave behind. 3 years, she said. I sat in that room and translated every treaty, every agreement, every piece of correspondence that came to that desk. I translated the words you wouldn't say in council, and the things you declined in private. I read the footnotes you read. I know the shape of the way you think, the things you notice watching, the things you notice that other people don't notice, what you choose when no one is watching. She set the pages down between them. And you did not know my name. I know, he said. I'm telling you this not to what? She stopped, started again. I loved you. The past tense deliberate or not deliberate, he couldn't tell, and he did not look away to avoid finding out. I loved you, and you looked through me as though I were a window, and I am telling you that now because it is true, and it happened, and it deserves to be said out loud at least once. Not because I want something from you, because it was real, and I was there, and someone should know. The candle stub guttered. The shadows moved. I know, he said again. Different this time. Not agreement with a fact. Something heavier. The specific gravity of a person who has received accurate information about damage they caused and is not going to offer the relief of diminishing it. I can't give you 3 years back. I can't be someone who wasn't that person. A pause. I can only tell you that I'm here, I see you. Now, today, for whatever it's worth. And I'm asking if that's enough to start from. She looked at him for a long moment. You're very bad at this, she said. Something loosened in his chest. I know. Say my name. He did not look away. Seren Ashvale. She heard her name in his voice, precise and unhurried. 3 syllables he would not again be careless with, and closed her eyes for a single second with an expression that she would not, later, be able to describe, but that he would remember for the rest of his life. Then she reached out and took his hand. The bond, the thing that had been pulling at her sternum for 3 days, the thing that the text had described as a resonance that worsened with separation, settled like a wave finding shore. Not gone. Quieter. Present in the way that the sea is present when you live near it. Not always audible, but underneath everything, always. He brought his other hand over hers. The candle stub burned down to the plate and went out, and neither of them moved, and the grey wood was very quiet around the monastery wall. When the light came back, a grey dawn seeping through the high window, they were still sitting there, not asleep. Seren was leaning slightly against his shoulder, which had happened by degrees and without discussion, the way 2 objects settle toward each other when nothing is preventing it. Kaid had not moved. He had been watching the window, and the window had been getting lighter. Dunvale, he said, into the quiet. She did not move. She was listening. There was a village in the Eastern Territories. There was an engagement. We had intelligence that the enemy commander was moving supplies through. I ordered an advance. He stopped. Started again. I knew the evacuation wasn't complete. I knew. I calculated the military advantage against the time the delay would cost, and I ordered the advance anyway. Silence. People died, he said. The words flat and precise. The way you say things that have been said inside a head so many times they've worn down to their plainest shape. Civilians. Families. Because I chose correctly, strategically, and incorrectly in every other way. Seren was very still. Through the bond, still new, still fragile, like something knitting together, she could feel it. The weight of it, not abstract guilt, but something physical. Like a stone that had been sitting in the same place for so long, the ground had shaped itself around it. Agna cursed me, he said. She was the last one left in the village. She said, you will feel the grief of every heart you fail to protect, until you choose to see the one that has already chosen to protect yours. He paused. I thought she meant something grand, a great act, a visible redemption. It was a woman sitting in a translation room for 3 years, Seren said quietly. Yes. She shifted, just slightly, so she could see his face. He was looking at the window. The light was coming through it cold and clear, the particular quality of winter light that showed everything without warmth. You think you deserve it, she said. The curse, you've been keeping it like a debt. He said nothing. Because letting it go feels like forgetting them. She kept her voice level, not to protect him from the words, but to make sure he could hear them. Carrying the pain feels like honoring them, but it isn't. It's only destroying you, and they can't see the difference. His jaw tightened. I spent 3 years believing I didn't deserve to be seen, she said. That I had to be useful, invisible, never asking. That love was something you earned by being small enough not to inconvenience anyone. She reached up and turned his face toward hers, her fingers on his jaw, the bandaged hand, and the gentleness in it made it mean more rather than less. We have both been lying to ourselves, Cedric. You, that suffering is the same as atonement. Me, that invisibility is the same as safety. And neither of those things is true. His eyes, gray, the color of river stone, the eyes she had been translating herself around for 3 years, were bright in a way that had nothing to do with candlelight. You're allowed to put it down, she said. You're allowed to have done a terrible thing and still live. That's not forgiveness for nothing. That's just the only direction time goes. Something broke open in him then. Not the curse, not yet, but the thing underneath it. The thing that had been holding the curse in place since Dunvale like a hand pressed against a wound, long after the bleeding had stopped. He pulled her against his chest and held on, and she felt the shudder run through him, the long exhale of someone who has been standing under a weight for so long they no longer knew what standing without it felt like. I see you, he said, into her hair. His voice was rough, stripped of every layer of command and ceremony. Seren, I see you. She did not say anything. She pressed her hand flat against his chest, over his heartbeat, and let him feel that she was there. Outside the window, the grey wood was getting lighter. Aldrich, stationed in the corridor with the patience of someone who had been waiting for this for 2 years, listened to the silence inside the room and finally, quietly, to no one, exhaled. The treaty had been signed. Not by Seren. She had finished the translation on her 3rd day back in Stonehaven, with the same even hand and the same steady pace, and handed the completed pages to Aldrich, who had looked at the 7 words still visible at the bottom of page 47, and said nothing for a moment. Both versions, Cade had said, when she offered to transcribe a clean copy, without the marginal notes and the evidence of work. Keep both. She had looked at him. One document that starts and stops tells part of a story, he said. The one that starts, pauses, and finishes tells it correctly. He had put the working draft and the final clean copy in the same box, plain pine, nothing notable about it, and set it on the shelf in their shared study. Leave it there, to remember that the right ending sometimes only needs more time and the right person to read what's missing. She had looked at the box for a moment. Then she had gone back to work. The months had been what they were. Lord Haveth had been difficult for exactly 6 weeks, which was less than she had expected, and more than she had patience for, and then had called her into a meeting about the Dunmore trade situation, with the manner of a man who was not asking for her input so much as acknowledging that she had already provided it, whether or not he'd ask. She had restructured the Dunmore agreement, not through marriage but through a trade compact that was, upon reflection, considerably more equitable to both parties. Lady Cerise had sent a brief and elegant letter of acknowledgement. She had not come to court, and no one had asked her to. Maren had been made head of the household staff, which she received with the equanimity of someone who had expected this to happen eventually and was satisfied to have been correct. "I'll still tell you when you're wrong," she'd told Seren, "on the day of the appointment, especially now that it's official." "That's why I recommended you," Seren had said. Brother Oswin had examined the king in the 6th month and reported, in his economical way, that the curse was receding in measurable increments. "You've been choosing," he said. "Every day is a choosing." "I know," Cade had said. At a spring reception, one of the formal court functions that Seren had spent 3 years attending invisibly, a senior lord had addressed her with the precise intonation that indicated he was asking about family lineage, while pretending to make conversation. Before she could answer, Cade's voice came from across the room. He had not moved toward her, had not raised his voice. He simply said clearly to the entire gathered space, "She translated the peace treaty that your house has been drawing revenue from for the last 8 months. If you have questions about her qualifications, I'd be glad to review the treaty with you." The room went quiet. Seren looked at him across the space. He was looking back, not with a sweep, not with the assessment of a room. At her, directly, with the full attention of someone who has made a decision and intends to keep it in plain sight. Being seen. Not once, not incidentally, continuously, and in front of people, and on purpose. She had not prepared herself for what that felt like. She was not sure it was possible to prepare for it. In the 8th month, Seren was in the Royal Library at the hour that had once been a secret. Not a secret now. The library in the evening was understood by the household in the way that certain understandings become domestic fact, quietly, without announcement, simply true. The East Wing, after the evening bell. 2 candles on the long reading table. The fire kept up. She was working on a Byzantine manuscript, a philosophical text about memory and action, which kept doing interesting things syntactically that she wanted to follow to their ends. The quill moved in its steady way. The fire was warm at her back. She was aware, without looking, of Cade at the other end of the table. He had come in 20 minutes ago with a stack of reports from the border territories, which he read with the quality of attention he gave to things that required solving. She had registered his arrival the way she registered all sounds in this room, precisely, without effort. She heard the pages settle. She heard the rhythm of his reading change. She knew he was looking at her. She let him look. She had been the one to look for 3 years, quietly and without permission, at everything that was not hers to look at. She understood now that the permission was not the point, had never been the point. The point was the looking itself, and whether it saw what it was looking at. The fire shifted. A log settled. The candlelight moved. He stood, she heard it, and walked around the end of the table. The chair beside her scraped back, the familiar weight of him settling beside her instead of across from her. "What's the problem?" he asked. She looked up. He was nodding at the manuscript. "The verb in this clause." She turned the page toward him, pointing without quite touching the line. In Standard Byzantine, it's a simple indicative, but the tense marker here suggests it could be read as a conditional perfect. The meaning changes significantly. He looked at the line. His Greek was workable, but not her register. He was looking at the structure of it, at the thing she was pointing toward, attending to the shape of the problem, even when he couldn't fully read it. "Read it to me," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back, not at the manuscript. She looked down at the page and began to read. Byzantine formale, the vowels long and unhurried, the clauses turning over themselves in the way that old languages did when they were working through something difficult. She read it for herself as much as for him, following the thread. His hand settled over hers on the table, not gripping, Just present, the pad of his thumb moving in a small arc, again and again, steady as a touch. She read to the end of the passage. She turned the page. Outside the library walls, Stonehaven was settling into its winter, the long dark of the northern season, cold moving in from the greywood, frost on the stones of the citadel. The city below the hill would be latching shutters and banking fires, finding the particular warmth that comes from expectation. Inside, 2 candles burned on a long table. A fire held its warmth steadily, without being asked to. She read, and he listened, and his thumb drew its small circle on the back of her hand, patient and present and unhurried. And that was enough. I see you. It didn't need to be said again. The thumb kept its quiet rhythm. She turned the page. End. 1.